is up, everybody? It's another episode of the Vish Kumaran Show. I'm Vish Kumaran, and I'm very, very excited to present this because this was kind of an impromptu idea I had, and it was to bring on two people I really respect. Two people I have a lot of conversations with over the course of the year about football. Two people who I find to be very detailed and in depth in how they analyze football and how much time they spend talking about it. And I'm really excited to talk about the draft and the quarterbacks with both of these people. To my left here, we have Nick Martin of Steelers Fan Nation. Nick is a really, really smart guy with incredible opinions about the draft, the quarterbacks. But really, if you want to go to his Twitter page and see his pinned tweet. He was on Patrick Mahomes before everybody else. So that kind of lets you know how good Nick is at this and this process. And then below me right there, we have somebody who should be pretty famous amongst 49ers
Nah.
fans and 49ers Twitter, and that's Billy of the Roar. You might know him for the animated profile picture on Twitter that somehow clips every single thing that's happened in the NFL seconds after it happened. But he is one of the most knowledgeable people I've had the pleasure of interacting with because, like, he's an encyclopedia of football knowledge and draft knowledge. In fact, I saw him post a screenshot the other day of a Nolan No Rocky 2017 pre-draft book. I didn't know many other people were consuming those draft books. My dad used to always buy them, first Joel Boschbaum and then Nolan No Rocky, and I used to just read them. When I was little, I used to rank players solely based on their 40 times. So when I was 7 years old, Jason Hill, I was so happy when the 49ers drafted him because he ran
Oh my
4.36 in his
gosh.
40, and Calvin Johnson ran 4.37. So I thought the Niners just got the next greatest player ever. Unfortunately, I was wrong, but that was an amazing pull. Guys, that was an insanely long introduction, but I can't introduce you guys enough. I'm so happy to do this. What's up? What's up to both of you?
Really appreciate you having me on. You give me a lot of pressure. As many hits as I have, I do have my fair share of misses. And, the biggest part about that is to just learn each year as you go, find different things, whether it be scheme, intricacies with the position. You're always constantly learning and adapting, especially as the NFL just continues to evolve. I mean, we just saw recently live, we saw the combine with all these defensive players and just how fast they are, and just like that wasn't something we'd picture like 10 years ago. And I think like that has caused us to evolve with some of our thinking on offensive players, and particularly some of the quarterbacks. Like we've seen the pure pocket passer almost go a little bit out of style recently. And I think a lot of that has to go with it. So, that's a really big example of just like, things I look for as things like change.
Billy, what's up, buddy?
Yeah, Vish, thanks for having me on, man. I know you and I have been speaking for a while. You joined my podcast this past year. So really happy to be on here talking quarterbacks.
All right, so let's get into it. Obviously, when we're talking about this draft class, there's a lot of names. I think maybe the number one thing I can say about this draft class is there's question marks about everybody, but there's a lot of different players that you can form a decent argument on why they could become an NFL starter. And that's probably the best way I would describe this class overall. But the name at the top, the most popular name, is obviously Bryce Young. And I think that's a great person for us to start with. Nick, obviously a lot of the talk circulating Bryce Young is going to be about his size, his stature. We're going to get to that. We're also going to talk about, the Bears, Justin Fields versus Bryce Young, all of that. But let's just talk about Bryce Young and what are the positive things that he does. When you watch Bryce Young, what do you think that he does that makes him such a highly touted prospect despite having, such a I guess not. I guess such a despite being in a unique position because of what his size is.
I would say there's two elite traits with him off the bat, and the first one that pops out the moment you watch the film, it's his ability to see the field pre and post snap. He's just constantly adapting, constantly making audibles at the line of scrimmage. It's just a huge part of his game, no matter what you watch, and just his ability to adapt to the post snap look when that when that look doesn't always match up pre-snap. And I think that's huge with a guy like that, especially when you talk about his pocket presence compared to like other smaller guys in the past. You know, Baker Mayfield didn't navigate the pocket nearly as well, or a Kyler Murray who kind of relied mostly on his athleticism. Bryce Young has incredible stop start intuition in the pocket and just a innate sense of how to set up and manipulate guys in the pocket. Like he sells lies with his shoulders, his hips, and it constantly gives him that extra space to be able to throw, like we saw like against LSU, Ole Miss, like those incredible throws on the move. Those types of plays, you know, those the reason why he's such a savant in the pocket is because he just has that manipulation down to a T. And it, you know, it also shows up with his eyes and his body and like, you know, the quick game and the intermediate range. Like he manipulates defenders outside. He can take defenders out of the picture in order to open up like guys in the middle of the field. And I think that's a huge aspect of quarterbacking is just being able to tell lies with your body, being able to throw off platform. Because the thing about quarterbacks is guys like Tom Brady, Patrick Mahomes, whether they be improvisers or pure pocket passers, you have to be able to throw off platform effectively. And I think Bryce Young does that so effectively from within the pocket. There's a huge misconception about what off platform throws are. And just being able to have your body aligned one way, but then be able to square your shoulders towards your target that's on the opposite direction, almost like you see a lot of no look passes, like similar to that in a way. Like that is the thing that really stands out with me with Bryce Young. He's just got an innate feel for the game.
Billy, I say Bryce Young. You say
Yeah, I mean, I say he's poised. I mean, if one word to describe him, like I can't really make a comparison. Like people like try to compare him to, I don't even want to bring that up, like Steph Curry, Mahomes, and I know you mentioned Joe Burrow, and some people have mentioned Deshaun Watson at Clemson. Watson at Clemson is probably a very valid comparison, just because there were a lot of similar traits with. A lot of people had concerns about Deshaun Watson when he came out because he held the ball on for a while. I don't. That is something that Bryce Young does, but for me, I think the way he just manipulates the pocket and uh, a lot of the issues short quarterbacks face, especially in the NFL, and you saw some of the limitations with not only just Russell Wilson, but Kyler also had a lot of struggles this year, and some of that can be come down to Cliff Kingsbury and his scheme, but throwing in the middle of the field. And for me, Bryce Young does really well throwing in the middle of the field. And uh, at Oklahoma, when I was watching Kyler, he had a lot of physical gifts. Like he's obviously bigger, and the way he just kind of moved around in the pocket. And some people like I think when defenses face these shorter quarterbacks, they try to just contain rush them, especially a guy like Murray and Young. So they're not necessarily getting upfield. They try to keep him in the pocket. And I remember just going back to 2018, Kyler, one of the issues that I remember is that he was very patient in the pocket, but he rarely, used the middle of the field to really kind of attack defenses. It was, throwing sideline tosses to C.D. Lamb or Marquise Brown.
right.
But I think the difference with Bryce Young is the past 2 years he played in NFL offense under Bill O'Brien, and so whatever you think of Bob, I mean he comes from like that Patriots Ernst um, Perkins system, I believe is what they call it, the EP. So he has a pretty good grasp of NFL offenses. He didn't have the supporting cast that Tua and Mac Jones had, so he's already kind of. I mean, I know there's some special guys that they're kind of coming through the ranks, but none of them compared to Jalen Waddle or Devontae Smith, um, Evan Neal, the offensive lineman they had. So for me, I just think like his ability to do more with less was very impressive, and like his tape is like perfect. It's just the questions about the size because a lot of the issues that defenses present now is how do you attack the middle of the field? And I thought he did a really good job of that, and he did it in the SEC. It's not like he's doing it in the um, the Mountain West or one of these other G5 conferences.
Yeah, I think both of you are kind of right on the money. When you're talking about Bryce Young, his poise and his natural instincts to play quarterback are what really blow you away. Like, he just has such a great sense of when he needs to escape the pocket, when he needs to move in the pocket, where he moves in the pocket. His pocket navigation is out of this world. And it's like weird the way he manipulates the pocket for a little guy, because usually when I think of quarterbacks that are very, very good in tight spaces, I think of bigger quarterbacks because they have such a capability to throw over and around people. Like Brady's the best example of this I can think
Hmm.
of, where he's not exceptionally fast, but within that tight space, and because he's so big, he's able to just move, subtly and create a little bit of space. And then he throws over the top of defenders. Young has this subtle manipulation too, where he's able to be in tight spaces and throw with people around him. But it's weird to
Yeah.
watch him do it because he's 6 foot, what, or 5'10" and a half, 185 pounds doing it. And that's where, like, you bring up the Kyler Murray example, right? Like, Young will stand in there like a big quarterback and hit like a backside dig or hit a late in breaking route. Like, from what I remember of Kyler Murray, and I was someone that really liked Kyler Murray coming out in the draft, a lot of his late in the down plays when you kept him in the pocket, like he would stand in there. It would just be a lot of deep overs that would be somewhere near the sideline when he's already throwing the ball. Like very rarely, like you mentioned, would it be an inbreaker that he would rip on time where when he's late in the down third progression, whatever. And so I thought that was something that was uniquely different about Young. Now, Young's size is obviously going to be the biggest part of this conversation. We've never seen a quarterback with this size, but I don't know. I feel like the Drew Brees comparison gets thrown around a lot for shorter quarterbacks, and I think there's always subtleties and nuances to Drew Brees' game that you just can't necessarily compare to. Now, I wouldn't compare Bryce Young to Drew Brees either, but if anybody has a chance to have that type of sustenance in terms of their career, I do think of the short quarterbacks that have come out over time, it is him. Now, he is not the athlete any of those other guys are, but they were also not the instinctive player he is, whether that's pre snap, post snap. I guess the one thing that makes him kind of the antithesis of Breeze is that he will pass up something that's open right away in rhythm, in structure at times, and sometimes hold on to the ball. But
Yeah.
then he is
Yeah.
one of the most natural players I've ever seen outside of the pocket. And
Yeah.
one of my, I would love to turn it over to one of you to talk about the size and obviously the Bears. But before I go, that one of my biggest gripes with quarterback evaluation is when a guy is big, he's athletic, he's capable of running, we immediately give him and say that guy can make second reaction plays. That guy can make off schedule plays. And one of the best examples of this for me was Justin Fields coming out of Ohio State, where I thought like for a guy that was so athletic and so capable of making plays, it wasn't a natural thing for him to have a great rhythm and timing of when things weren't there and when he should escape the pocket, use his legs and set himself up to throw or create an explosive off schedule. Bryce Young might not be the biggest guy. He might not have the strongest arm. He might not have that, but he instinctively creates space and time and creates off schedule plays. I mean, Burrow and Herbert are a great example, right? Herbert is the prototypical guy you would expect to make the off schedule plays, but it's really Burrow to me that has the natural, more instinctive knack for doing that. And I think Bryce Young has that knack, and that knack is so important in the modern NFL. Billy, I like both the comps you threw out. Joe Burrow's a little extreme because the size is different. I do think, like you said, Watson is the comp. Though I do think what I thought of Watson's arm when he came out of Clemson, I think I like Bryce Young's arm in terms of strength a little bit better. Now, I don't know if it's as strong as what we saw Watson's arm in the NFL. We'll see that. But
I actually want to add one quick thing.
go
You're
ahead.
talking about Kyler Murray. So you were talking about like how Kyler would he would constantly run around. The biggest difference between him and Bryce Young for me, Bryce Young knows how to stop himself and reset within the pocket or just give himself like that throwing, give him that clean platform to throw from.
Mm-hmm.
The thing with Murray is he was constantly throwing from a moving platform, and it's because his arm could get away with it. If Young was doing something like that, we would be having a completely different conversation about the type of prospect he is because of the difference in arm talent. And I think all those limitations have actually helped him, like mold and develop his game, to a higher nuances. That at least that's how I can take it.
No, yeah, I think that's really, really a great point. And that's the kind of subtlety I think that's so important because a lot of times during this process, it's going to be very blanketed where short players are going to be put into a specific category, tall players, fast players. Everybody's going to be grouped a certain type of way. And I think that takes away from the subtle nuances that makes each of these individual players what they are. But obviously, we've spent 15 minutes talking about Bryce Young. And besides Billy hitting on it for maybe a little bit there, we haven't talked about the size. And then, of course, the $1 million question is, what should the Bears do? Billy, I'm actually going to go to you first here.
Mm-hmm.
If you were the Bears, what do you think they should do? And then obviously, does Bryce Young's size scare you out of him being, perhaps a top 10, top 15 pick? Now, obviously he's going to go there, but the reason I say top 10, top 15 is, Bill Parcells used to say, and Sean Payton actually made this pretty famous this year because he said it on the herd, that in your first 15 picks, you should always draft prototype players, meaning, players that check, if in that position, they check every single height, weight, speed, and tangible requirement. And the only way you don't is if it's truly a special player. So obviously, Billy, the two questions: what should Chicago do? And then, is this truly a special player where you take him with the top 15, top 10, top 5 pick, despite one of the biggest question marks being his size?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought up that Parcells quote. I was watching PFT. They were interviewing all these GMs and head coaches. And I think, guy you know pretty well, Trent Baalke, worked for Bill Parcells, and Chris Sims asks him, "Yeah, you want a?" He said essentially, "Yeah, you want a team that looks really good getting off the bus." I think that's a Parcellism, as they like to call it, and that makes
Right.
sense for me. Like, it's easy for me just on the outside. Like, I don't get paid millions of dollars to make these type of decisions, but I would feel comfortable taking Young, and I think it's difficult to answer. I mean, you're from Chicago, like it's again, I've been to Chicago a few times, not in the winter. I mean, remember that game in the week one when it was pouring, and there's obviously games all during the year where the weather is an issue. So I mean, it's not like Bryce Young played in just 60 to 70-degree weather, no winds at all. I mean, he's has experience playing in different climates. The question is how is he going to translate to a climate like Chicago? Um, if if he was like a little bigger and showed like the physical dimensions that you know a lot of the elite quarterbacks who get taken in the top 10 have, then I don't think it's even a question. I think they would do it. Like if Caleb Williams was coming out this year, I don't think there's any second guessing the Bears in this situation. It's a very unique class, and I do think that given where they play, because they also have to play in Green Bay and they have to play in other cold weather climates, it's certainly a relevant talking point. And I know a lot of people, look back to the 2017 draft when they passed on Deshaun Watson and
Mahomes.
Mahomes. I think passing on Mahomes was a little more crazier, given that Pat definitely had the skill set. I can kind of justify if they didn't feel that way about Watson, but still, are they going to, come to grips with that realization again? I don't know. And I know there's other like, talking points about the rookie contract scale and how you should approach that. I mean, if I'm just gonna evaluate the two as I see it, I think Justin Fields and Bryce Young are probably um, similar prospects in a way. I think, but Fields has the physical gifts that kind of give him maybe higher upside.
Nick, thoughts?
So for me, with Bryce Young versus Justin Fields, Fields was my number 2 in that year's draft class, behind Trevor Lawrence. Lawrence is one of the highest quarterbacks I've ever graded, and Fields was close. He wasn't quite there, and a lot of it was something you mentioned. He wasn't a natural guy at making guys miss within the pocket because his reaction time was a little slower. He didn't quite move as well. So that was one of the things I had a question about, but I never questioned his accuracy and his ability to just place it as well as possible. As mentioned with legs, his legs, which weren't as big of a factor, at Ohio State. Obviously we've seen it this year with just his ability to run for over 1,100 yards and break rushing records for a quarterback. It's incredible. For me, I definitely do think weather is something you have to train in to be mostly prepared for. When we saw Drew Brees go out of the dome, you could see a lot of times like his ball placement and the way it came off his hand wasn't always as accurate as you would like it. And it's not necessarily because his arm couldn't handle it, is because he wasn't playing in those conditions. And I think that's a huge part of getting drafted is getting used to the environment around you. I think that would be an adjustment for Bryce Young, given that he can't exactly throw with the highest velocity. So he has to adapt for that in terms of the types of throws he should and shouldn't make. In terms of what I take Young over Fields, I I have a promising young quarterback who's already showing growth at this point in his career. I just can't see myself selecting Bryce Young and trading Fields away because I'm already seeing like the fruits of the labor come through with Fields, and I know there wasn't a great team around him at the time, especially with the injuries to guys like Darnell Mooney. And I don't necessarily have the highest opinion of Chase Claypool, but that's for a different day. And that's big thing for me is just like the arm strength, the ability to run, the accuracy. There's a lot of great traits, and then there's a lot of stuff that he's been working on and he understands he has to improve on. And given the improvement, from year one to year two, with deteriorating circumstances, I just can't see myself taking Bryce Young. I would trade the pick away and try and put weapons around him to help him survive.
Yeah, so I think this is actually a very, very complicated question. And for me, the reason it's complicated is because in a vacuum, I do think Bryce Young is the better player. Um, there's so many things I liked about Justin Fields coming out of college. Like for me, I always thought the number one thing that always made me like I guess overlook some of his more glaring weaknesses that were just sometimes lacking just a natural instinct to play the position, which is the antithesis of Bryce Young, because everything is so natural, everything is so instinctive and feeling it, was the fact that he was an uber athlete with uber accuracy, especially down the field. Like it was like top notch. I thought his accuracy, especially down the field, was the best in the class. So I thought, where the weaknesses lie, I thought this was a Russell Wilson kind of player where the accuracy and the athleticism overcomes so many things in his game that may need a refinement and a polish. And in some ways, he's been that player. In some ways, he hasn't. I do think the concerns with Fields in the pass game go beyond just the lack of weapons and the pass protection. There are still so many questions on why he's passing up the throws he's passing up in rhythm, on time, and structure. And then the pocket management is very, very much hit or miss. And sometimes it feels very deliberate where if he gets out of the pocket, it's only to run. If he stays in the pocket, he's only going to throw. And it's not like there's not a natural mix of him doing both. But where this conversation gets complicated is because the situation really matters. And to me, in an even situation with a neutral team, I would say get rid of Justin Fields and go to Bryce Young. It's not that I don't think Justin Fields has a ceiling and has an opportunity to be a good player, because he's obviously maybe the most elite ball carrier in the NFL. So that's a very special part of his game. It's just that I think Bryce Young is a better quarterback than him. Now, in Chicago, I say absolutely not. Like to me, Bryce Young makes no sense in Chicago. His game is built right on so much get him in rhythm, get him in flow, and it's very precise, rhythmic, timing, accurate. In Chicago, there's days where you walk outside in October and November where you're not expecting to throw the ball. You got to win grinded out kind of football games. And those are the kind of games Justin Fields is built to win. I think the style Eberflus wants to play, they want to play through their defense. They want to run the football. Justin Fields is the perfect fit for who they are. His toughness, his character, his grit. Not that Bryce Young doesn't have those qualities, because he does have them in spades too. But I just think with Justin Fields' attitude, it just kind of works better with the city of Chicago. I also think there's enough improvements between Justin Fields from the start of the year to the end of the year for you to at least feel like, okay, maybe there's a chance he takes the Hurts jump. Like you got to think there's a chance when you look at how talented the player is. And so in a vacuum, again, I do think Young is the better player. I really do. I just feel like there's so many natural, instinctive, special things to his game. It's like you just turn him on, and it's almost every play is just like the perfect thing the quarterback could have done. Like it's really magical how well he played to me. But for Chicago, there's no way that that makes sense to me. Like no way it makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. If it was like a situation like Miami or something like that, like going from a Bryce Young to or from a Tua to a Bryce Young, even though I have a high opinion of Tua, I do think or a decent opinion of Tua. I don't want to say too high, but
Vish
you
loves
know,
him.
yeah.
Oh,
And the thing with Bryce Young is like, actually, I kind of want to segue this a little bit, but you mentioned how Bryce Young is a shorter quarterback, and we've seen guys struggle over the middle of the field. One of my favorite examples of quarterbacks who is a little shorter, but he throws over the middle of the field pretty well is Tua, because he's 6 foot flat. He's not the tallest
yeah.
guy, but he throws with such great anticipation to the middle of the field. He sees guys, he's throwing to space. He's not throwing to to the person. And I think that's one of the huge things about quarterbacking. And I see it a lot with Bryce Young. And in a great environment, like if you were in, I don't know, like out west or in Florida, it would make a lot, or in a dome, like it would make so much sense for Bryce Young. It's the ideal situation for him. But we're talking about Chicago and the ability to grind out those wins, on the ground. And Fields, he fits that city's mold. And it's a saying, not everyone will go with it, but it does matter, culture, team fit, in terms of environment. It's a big part of the evaluation.
And it's not something
Yeah.
you can practice in either. Like the off season is between January to until training camp starts in August, and players are usually going to vacation from like January to like March or something, just trying to chill out. So you can't really just like go out and like you know 10-degree weather in Chicago and just throw the ball around. It's something that just has to come natural for you. And for a lot of people laughed it off at the time, but the Bills, one of the main reasons they did take Josh Allen was because he played at Wyoming, which comes in a very cold environment, and he had the strongest arm in that draft class. And again, a lot of people kind of said, you're looking for a quarterback that can win in the AFC East, and he fit that mold. Obviously, hindsight now, a lot of people were wrong about their evaluations about the 2018 QB class, but I think Josh Allen kind of gives you a good example of just looking for quarterback play that matches the climate where the team is. And I think Houston, Indianapolis, even Carolina or Atlanta, those are 4 teams that are rumored to be potentially trading up to number 1. I think those would be great spots for Bryce Young, because in Atlanta he would play, 8 home, whatever, 8 or 9 home games, and he has a dome game in New Orleans, and Tampa's weather is always warm, and Carolina for the most part the weather is pretty decent up until like December. But again, you get the road games in Atlanta, New Orleans, and Tampa, and the same thing with the AFC South teams, Houston and Indianapolis.
Yeah, the weather is absolutely a real point, right? The best example to me of weather making a difference. Look at the quarterbacks that have represented the AFC in the Super Bowl in the last 20 years, right? You basically in the last 20 years to go to the Super Bowl, you had to win in Pittsburgh, you had to win in New England, obviously, you had to win in Kansas City. I mean, they all have size and the capability of throwing it weather, right? Brady, one of the best cold weather quarterbacks we've ever seen. Flacco, I always thought the biggest reason his jump would happen in the playoffs was he had just a physical ability in terms of his stature and his arm that was different. And I thought that was one of the reasons Manning maybe necessarily would wear down over the course of the season, because he was so used to playing in that dome. And then you would have to go and play in New England, play in Pittsburgh. I thought it would make a difference. Oh, it made a little bit of a difference. Before we go to Stroud, the one last thing I wanted to touch on is the point you made, Nick, about throwing into space, right? I think while we're on these two quarterbacks, Fields and Young, I do think that that's a very important subtlety when we're talking about accuracy, right? A lot of people equate accuracy to a percentage and a lot of that. I think the difficulty with accuracy is that most of these quarterbacks are able to throw it to a stationary target. So if you
Yeah.
told them to throw it to a target 20 yards down the field, I guarantee you, most of them would go 10 for 12 and they would hit the bullseye 10 times. Like they can rip it accurately. It's about being able to throw it accurately to a space that you're anticipating somebody to come into. And for me with Fields, like the reduction in accuracy between Ohio State to the Bears is not that Justin Fields now can no longer hit a stationary target, like he's simply not throwing the ball as accurate. It's just that to me, he doesn't have that extra split second to confirm where he's going to throw it, and he's seeing it. And he has to let it loose just a tad bit earlier, and the speed and the timing. And he's still not fully comfortable with that in the pass game. In fact, that's why sometimes I feel like he passes up throws. We feel like he should make that a routine because sometimes he needs
especially in
that
the quick
extra
game.
second. Right. And and Ohio State, he did the same thing. But when he took that extra hitch, when he's able to, throw it, 35 yards on a rope to Chris Olave, to Jamison Williams, it's like, who cares that he took that slight extra hitch? But I do think that makes a difference. But while we're on Ohio State quarterbacks, there's another Ohio State quarterback who is highly touted in this draft. To me, actually, he's a little bit more polarizing than Bryce Young. It's not because we don't know what his game is. I just feel like we are kind of so sure of what his game is. I feel like his strengths and weaknesses seem to be so binary, so clear. Billy, I'm actually going to start with you because I think we started with Nick on Bryce Young. What do you think about CJ Stroud and kind of where we'll talk about CJ Stroud relative to this class later. Just give me your thoughts on CJ Stroud. Last time we did a strengths weaknesses, just give me a jumbled up kind of summary of what you think of him.
Yeah, so for me, CJ Stroud is, I say this in the most complimentary way possible, he is an excellent game manager. Like, he understands just a lot of the fundamentals about playing quarterback. Like, he has a pretty nice release. The ball comes out of his hands really well. His footwork, for the most part, especially when he's reaching the top of this drop, is very efficient. There's rarely some wasted motions regarding, his hitch. I think he has the necessary arm talent to reach all levels of the fields, and I just think like there were a lot of questions with C.J. Stroud as the year went on, and I think that game against Georgia answered so many questions. But for evaluators, they have to go back and really kind of test him and figure out like why didn't you show this type of why can you play like this in other games like the Northwestern game? I know it was like 40 miles per hour wind, and I actually was sort of impressed with that game because, again, even though he didn't throw the ball very well, he used his legs in a way that I didn't see all year, and I thought that was very impressive. So he definitely has, to me, and I think a comp that kind of resonated. It's maybe a more athletic Jared Goff, Geno Smith type quarterback. Um, so yeah,
The
and I'm
freak
I'm glad you
agrees.
just mentioned that. I think someone just mentioned in the comments here. It's very similar to Goff, and let's not forget. Like I know a lot of people like to make fun of Jared Goff, and I do too. But he did go one overall in 2016, and he's been playing at a pretty above average level. Now the question is, do you think you can compete like the Rams did for a Super Bowl with C.J. Stroud on a rookie contract? I think you can. And so, yeah, it's obviously he has a tremendous amount of talent around him, and you have to be able to separate his evaluation with what he's working with. And I think that offense in general, I'm not gonna. It's not similar to the McVay or Shanahan offense, but I think it's similar in the fact that you place the ball where it needs to be placed, and a wide receiver will be there. Like if you just throw it to the landmark, that's exactly where you should go. And I think the questions I had about his ability under pressure and how he does under second reaction, I think he did a tremendous job of showing that in the Georgia game. So we'll see if he,
True.
if that's who he is or if that was just like an outlier performance.
Nick, CJ Stroud, what do you think?
Watching CJ Stroud is actually has brought me back a lot to when I was watching Justin Herbert back in the day, where a lot of narratives that came this year might not have existed the year prior. When I watched CJ Stroud this year, he was dreadful at times under pressure, but it wasn't because it was pressure. It was because he was drifting back in pockets, in clean pockets, and just throwing from these unnecessary drifting angles. And I just thought that was very uncharacteristic. It's not something that you want to see with a quarterback, particularly, a guy like Stroud. But, even all that saying, I do think he showed the ability to be accurate from those off and those moving platforms. Granted, there was a lot of inconsistency in that regard. And it's funny about the narratives. So I was going back and looking at Stroud's career numbers, and I go back to his 2020 and I see he has a 47-yard rushing touchdown. I'm like, what is this? And then I go and I find it. And he has a 47-yard rushing touchdown on a read option versus Michigan State, and he is just absolutely moving. And that level of speed, that athleticism, it was before the Georgia game, a lot of people did not believe CJ Stroud was an athletic quarterback, and I thought that was bunk. I just thought he wasn't. His offensive line was so good that it was giving him reasons to want to drift back in clean pockets or exit out the back door and try and throw on the move, because he was just that was just what was coming second. That was his second reaction at that point. And for me with Stroud, I think he has just, if there's an elite trait with him, it's accuracy, placement, being able to layer the ball. There's no one in this class that comes close to being able to just layer it over guys and in between, like the over the top defender. He just has an innate sense of being able to throw guys open when they are not open. Even Bryce Young, to a degree, struggles with this because he's mostly throwing around coverages. He's not throwing over them. And I think it's a big thing with CJ Stroud. I also think he manipulates well with his eyes, especially, I think he throws with great anticipation as well. Granted, I think it's a little inconsistent from game to game because a lot of times you see him take like an awkward hitch, like an awkward extra step, like he false steps at times off his drop.
And that also is an Ohio State offense thing, right? Not to interrupt, because we saw the quarterback that came out 3 years ago that we just kept talking about do that so much.
Yes, agreed. And that's, Stroud has not had a lot of quarterback, like he hasn't had like many quarterback coaches throughout his time. So he can get a little toesy and it causes him to miss a little wide occasionally. Bryce Young also does that. I think it's really close, honestly, for me between Bryce Young and CJ Stroud. And I know it might not always be that for everyone else because they'll look at what Bryce Young does off those improvisation and his ability to just make those second reaction, those instinctual plays. For me, I think CJ Stroud is underrated in the pocket because he finds space before the rush gets there. And that's something I noticed with him, that even in the Georgia game, I
think we lost Nick there for a second. Let's see if he comes. There he
makes
is.
A second reaction play, okay.
Nick, we lost you there for a second. Yeah, go ahead. Continue. I think you were talking about a second reaction play he made.
Yeah, he just knows, he'll have pressure, he knows that the blitz, that they're going to stunt or something. So he takes two small steps to his right, just gives himself enough space to be able to make a clean pocket throw. And I think that's a huge trait. That's something not very many quarterbacks, especially in last year's class, had the ability to do. And when you see that with a guy like CJ Stroud, I think I can overlook a little bit of the inconsistencies in that regard. And I think that ability to layer the ball is it's special, and there's really good arm talent. Especially with the running ability, I think there's upside there. I think there's upside untapped regardless of how good he is already. And that's why I'm so excited about Stroud, because I do think he has some non-game manager tendencies that he flashes every now and then, and I think it's worth cultivating, and that's why this conversation is kind of close for me.
Yeah, and it's funny you brought up Herbert. I was gonna bring up Herbert too, in a little bit of a different way, but also a similar way in the sense that if you remember Herbert that senior year, I think it was the Rose Bowl that the Oregon played, and that was when we got to see kind of Justin Herbert that one time that year, like fully unleashed, and we got to see his athleticism and all of that. And a lot of people were shocked by how athletic he was, similar to CJ Stroud versus Georgia. And to me, if there's one, trait that I can chalk up Justin Herbert's game to, a lot of people chalk it up to a variety of different things. To me, it's really his size, and then the fact that he is just a consistent bullseye like thrower. Like he is like a bullseye thrower. Like he is like right. And if you want to talk about the hallmark of Stroud's game, to me, it's that. Like he is a lot of the really smart scouts and everybody, all those people that we get to listen to so often during draft time, will start talking about the difference between a thrower and a passer, right? CJ Stroud is like by definition a passer. Like what you talked about, right? Both of you layering the ball. It's so advanced for a college quarterback to be able to change pace, manipulate the ball like this when he puts touch on it, how much touch he puts on it, even the timing of the trajectory of the ball to where he's throwing it, right? He'll throw a seam with the safety out 30 yards and it'll be on a rope. And then he'll also throw it where, the safety has to make up ground, where he'll get put real air under it and put it right on the money. He throws it towards the sideline very well, using the sideline to protect his receivers exceptionally well. He protects his receivers with his placement exceptionally well.
Yes.
My big issue is what you guys touched on but didn't focus on enough. And Nick, you especially touched on it. It's the drifting in the clean pockets. That to me is really, really scary when we're talking about a guy whose game is generally just built on quick structure and timing. Like the fact that to me he plays with so much depth in the pocket when, in the NFL, he's not going to have the time and space that he has. That really, really scares me. And I don't know if it's a habit that he can grow out of. And then the inconsistencies throwing under pressure. I know that brings up the Goff comparison. I think the Goff comparison is a little bit disrespectful to Stroud. Not that Goff isn't a good player, just that I think he has a better arm and he's more consistent throwing than even Goff. I think so. I think I like Geno. I know Billy brought up Geno. I really like the Geno comparison. And it's in a similar sense that they have this athleticism that they only use as their last resort. They really want to just hang back and hang deep in the pocket and push the ball down the field. And they throw the ball with great power and accuracy and consistency. But that pocket management, to me, it is something that scares me. Look, some of the quarterbacks that we've seen not work out like recently, right? Like Dwayne Haskins, Josh Rosen, these guys, they didn't work out for a variety of reasons. But there was always one thing that I could go back to them in college, right? They were both very consistent, accurate, aesthetically pleasing, mechanically pleasing throwers. But I thought they were both horrible at managing the pocket in terms of finding space, in terms of where they found space. Now, I think Stroud is way better than that. Like you said, Nick, he does have an instinct and a feel to find space on where the rush is going to be and where he can have space to throw the ball. But I also think he needs space to throw the ball, which kind of scares me a little bit. And so to me, he's actually a harder evaluation than Young, because when you look at Stroud at his best, like he looks like a guy that's just like the perfect orchestrator of an offense, right? He's so poised, he's tough, he's durable, he manages the offense, he's so accurate, he gets you in and out of the hut. He does everything that you want, right? That everybody puts as cliches as your quarterback. But the inconsistencies managing the pocket, to me, especially when we're talking about an NFL where offensive line play is increasingly depreciating, defensive line play is getting better and better. I mean, we saw them run today. There's a bunch of freaks in every single draft coming out. Every team, it feels like, has two freak pass rushers. How many teams have two good offensive linemen? I don't know, maybe 10 to 12 in the NFL. That's how much good line play is a scarcity. And so because of that, and you're talking about pocket management being one of your major concerns about a player, I definitely think it is something. And then, yes, he plays with great accuracy and placement, and he does have that. But I don't know if he has a particularly excellent, when we're talking about sense of like diagnosing when to throw the ball and throwing it with great timing and anticipation. He does at times, but it's not particularly consistent, as Nick mentioned. And if he is going to be a quarterback that wins with structure and with his accuracy, to me, he also has to be an A+ in that other area too. And I don't know if he's an A+ in that area. And so that makes me, when you throw in the pocket management, that's a little bit scary. And the fact that when he does use his athleticism, it doesn't feel instinctive. It feels deliberate. it does make me think, like, if you're talking about a top 5 pick, a day 1 starter at quarterback, I I don't know. Like, I know he's talented. He's probably going to be a top 10 pick. Like, he's a good quarterback, but like you could very easily argue it's to me it's not as cut and dry as Bryce Young is all I'm trying to say for me. I mean, that's even with Bryce Young's size concern.
Yeah, I
Yeah, I
think
would
that.
agree.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Billy, were you gonna go? Because I know you
No,
need.
I certainly agree with Fish. I do think his arm is it's really tough to really judge it because like he doesn't really have the flash arm throws that you see some of these other quarterbacks like a Richardson or Levis. So again, like he does have enough velocity, but to me when I watched Herbert, especially I think it was Herbert's sophomore year, which was his first year
Yeah.
starting, like he was exceptional that year. I thought this guy was like the, potential number one overall pick.
He looked like
Eh,
Andrew Luck that year.
Yeah, yeah, it was
Yeah.
really good. And then he progressed, and then the next year it was again a mixed bag. It wasn't necessarily a regression. So I never thought that Stroud showed that type of arm strength.
I did.
But at
Yeah,
the same time, like that's why I tried to make the again. I think he's a better version of Jared Goff, and that's kind of what I'm trying to get through. And so much about quarterback play. I think a lot of people they get enamored with these highlight throws, and the biggest question I ask myself whenever I see that is will this type of throw translate in the NFL? Because the with all due respect to like some of the better defenses in the college game, eh, there's just a lot of bad defense in college football. And so when you have like a post safety like Marvin Harrison going up against a safety in the middle of the field, I mean that's just not going to translate in the NFL. And I think
Right.
the biggest example, and again, I'm not making this comparison. I think he's clearly better. It's just too many people got excited about Zach Wilson's like highlight throws when they didn't put any type of context into if those type of throws translate into the game, NFL game. But I do think that Stroud has the NFL level arm talent and just his overall like quarterbacking ability. I think it's a pretty respectable to solid level for a prospect and given his size and other mobility and the fact that he did it at a blue blood program, I think that's going to drive him up the boards. For me, he's my clear QB2. Um, but yeah, I certainly see the issues that you mentioned, Vish.
Nick, before you go, I want to throw this question into the pool because
I got you.
to me, I think the thing is quarterbacks have started going so high that I feel like we've kind of redefined what is a top 10 pick at quarterback. And for me, a top 10 quick pick at quarterback is still a little bit of the old definition where it's a guy that you feel like you can put into a situation that's not necessarily ideal and you feel like he can handle it and elevate that situation. And where I do think the golf comparison works is I do think if you can put CJ Stroud on the Lions today, I think he would be a star. If you
Yeah,
could put CJ Stroud on those Rams teams where you protect him, you run the football, and you give him, especially if you can make him get play in rhythm with very, very defined throws in structure, like he can rip it. Like he's gonna throw for yards, touchdowns. He's gonna kill it. But then if you're gonna tell me and say the Houston Texans draft C.J. Stroud, they don't keep Brandon Cooks, and he's got to play a year with an offensive line that's actually not that bad when Laramie Tunsil is healthy and playing pretty well. But Bobby Slowick that's gonna have his growing pains as a coordinator, a very very young defense on the other side, and a very young team, and you're gonna say, well, C.J. Stroud is gonna overcome all of these different things. I have questions about kind of the athlete he is physically and just the skill set that he showed, whether he can overcome all of that. And so when we're talking about like a top 5, top 10 pick at quarterback, to me, I'm still thinking of that. And to me, when the previous guy we talked about, Bryce Young, I say checks the box 100%. I think he could do that. Stroud, I'm a little bit, well, maybe he's like a special human being, right? That's the part that we never get to judge. So like maybe there's just an intangible quality to Stroud that's like a Dak Prescott where he can play this kind of like style of game, but he elevates people around him with who he is. Or I don't know. Maybe that's there, but I just on the field, I have a big question mark with that. Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, like when you talk about top 10 pick, for me, if I'm taking a guy in the top 10, it's someone I personally want to bet on. Like if I'm taking a guy in the top 10 and I think he can be, let's say, like a Kirk Cousins in the league, that's how I feel. If you can be at that like mark, personally, I think that's worth taking in the top 10. Now, preferably, you want a guy with more upside. We'll have this discussion at some point, in regards to the Levises and the Richardsons.
Right.
And, we talk about the Josh Allens and the Patrick Mahomeses of the world. I definitely think there's a lot of narrative that surrounds those guys in terms of, whether or not the perfect situation was needed for them or everything had to go perfectly for them. Like it's a nuanced conversation, and who knows if Josh Allen would have succeeded if he had gone to the Browns per se.
Yes.
It's a lot of there's a lot of questions like that, but that's where I feel like it's a personal evaluation thing. If you personally like a guy, and this is where you go with a personal versus team, because based on what your team has, if you're confident in your quarterback's coach and ability to draft around them, protect them, that's the important part. Because if you don't have that confidence, you might not want to take a guy like a Josh Allen or an Anthony Richardson.
Right.
It just, you're probably not going to get the best development out of them overall. And that's what we saw. Maybe guys like a Jalen Hurts end up
Right.
falling to the second round, when some speculated he could have gone into the first round that year. And
By the way, who was high on Jalen Hurts as well?
I was
You were high on him, right?
no, that's my biggest
Uh,
miss.
I
I was.
liked him. I
I
didn't
think it was
understand the
Billy.
pick. I did like him as a
Yeah.
prospect. I thought he got picked where he should have in the second round.
Yeah.
I was just a little confused why Philly at the time took him because I thought Wentz was still a decent quarterback, but credit to
Uh,
Yeah,
Philly
it's
for
it,
my bad. I mixed up two different conversations I had with each of you about Hurts. By the way, Nick, it's all good because as you know, I also was a big swing and a miss on Jalen Hurts.
it
Um,
it'd be like that in this nature. You just
it
gotta
does,
learn
it does,
but
and
but that's the thing about
go ahead,
QB
Billy.
evaluation. It's like
the
and
team.
there's just so much that we on the outside don't know.
Yes.
And especially like when I read stuff, I know Matt Miller said something about Anthony Richardson having like phenomenal interviews. Someone reported that Bryce Young has again been tremendous in interviews, showing off his football acumen. I think you mentioned it earlier, Vish, about just the ability to elevate the talent around him and become that type of transcendent talent. I think that is what Bryce Young is. And I think that is how, I mean, if you're like a Houston Texans, I think a guy like that fits perfectly with them just because of the fact that, uh, he, again, I don't know his intangibles. I don't have all of the information regarding it. But if you go back to the 2019 draft, there were plenty of people who, said that Dwayne Haskins probably wasn't the most mature guy out there, and could he be able to lead an NFL team? And certainly, he also
Rosen, same
faced,
thing.
yeah, and certainly with Haskins, we had similar questions about the Ohio State offense and Ryan Day. I think that was his first year as a coordinator. So um, for me, I just think like the film for QB evaluation is like just a part of it, whereas
Yeah.
the intangibles, it matters a lot in my opinion. And I think the two guys that we'll get to, I think those are perfect illustrations of it. And for us on the outside, we don't have access to the kind of character report, the
Right,
medical
right.
information, all that stuff, so we can just judge off what we see on tape and it kind of makes our life a little difficult. But again, we've seen examples of Josh Allen, for one, a guy who just had amazing character and interviews, and he really seems to be a great leader. Uh, I think personally, just watching Bryce Young from the outside. I think he can be that guy, and I certainly think the other three too have an opportunity. But um, again, I haven't seen it, and I'm not privy to what NFL teams are writing on these guys.
Right, and that's a big part of it, right? We don't know what their growth capacity is, what happens to their life when they make this transition from going to a college athlete to being a professional, moving to a new city, having to deal with the whatever distractions, all of that. So there's so many other details that go into it. We can only talk about the football element. Before we do leave Stroud and go to those other two guys, I want to just make this concluding statement on Stroud. I do understand why a lot of people have him as quarterback too, and I think it's very, very valid from a skill set standpoint. The difference I would say between him and the other two guys we're talking about, to me, if you draft one of those other two guys, your entire franchise has to be embraced around the idea of going through a period where these guys figure out how to play. With CJ Stroud, that period might never exist when you draft him. He might be able to draft him and you might be able to put him in your offense day one. He's ready to go and he can do all the basic quarterback things, right? I always talk about this with Shanahan's offense, right? The reason all these veteran quarterbacks do so well in it is there's a rudimentary quarterbacking level that's needed to play within the offense. And it's just a rudimentary level from your footwork, sense of timing, accuracy standpoint. But if you do have that rudimentary level, man, we can see Nick Mullins produce. We can see Matt Schaub produce. We can see CJ Beathard have a little bit of success. Matt Ryan win an MVP. Jimmy Garoppolo go to 2 NFC championship games. Brock Purdy look like one of the best rookie quarterbacks we've ever seen. And so similarly, I would say like CJ Stroud does have that. I do think if you're talking about a top 10, top 15 quarterback, in terms of CJ Stroud, I don't know if I'm fully embracing that idea, but I don't know if we go off just obviously quarterbacks are going to be overvalued in general. I don't know if I feel that way about the guys that we're going to talk about right here in Levis and Anthony Richardson as well as just like, oh my gosh, take them in the top 10. But let's start with the guy who to some is the more polarizing of the two. I would say he's definitely the guy. In some ways, I feel like there's a little bit of a Jordan Love, Justin Herbert kind of thing going on with Will Levis and Anthony Richardson, where everybody told us Levis should be a certain quarterback. And now all the draft guys and the draft film guys are getting into it and they're posting the same 5 plays over and over and over again about Anthony Richardson and saying the same 6 things about Will Levis over and over again. And the perception is now like Richardson, I've seen QB1, I've seen QB2, QB3, and Levis is like a QB4. But Nick, I know you were really excited to talk about Will Levis. You were talking about him before we even started live here. He is a very complex prospect. He's a very polarizing player with 2 completely different seasons that give you 2 completely different perspectives on what you think he is as a player between 2021 and 2022. So let's get into it. Will Levis, what are your thoughts?
For me, I see the arm talent, I see the size, and I was so excited about him, especially because back in, the going into the 2022 draft, he was a guy I thought could declare. He ended up not, and I had questions about him, but at the same time, I was excited about his arm talent. I'm not watching these guys in depth at that point, but you see the outer throws, the flashes and stuff like that. Levis is a guy that it's very tough because when you go and look at his superior comparisons, like a Justin Herbert, a Matthew Stafford, or a Josh Allen, for me, I don't see the improvisational ability or like the balance that like a Josh Allen had in terms of being able to shrug off guys and make pinpoint accurate throws while rolling to his left or his right. And I think that's one of the big differences between those two. And I don't see the consistent anticipation that we saw from Justin Herbert at like his best in terms of being able to manage the quick game. Because the thing about Kentucky's offense, they run the quick, they have the Rich Scangarello, the Liam Cohens, they have all these built in, shorter throws. And I just didn't feel like he was playing with consistent timing and anticipation when it came to those throws. And then I think he was good from a pre-snap perspective. I think he controlled the line of scrimmage more so in 2022 than I saw in 2021, honestly, because I think in 21 they were kind of feeling him out at first, and then he started to really, take the reins over time. And in 22, you know, he had a lot more responsibility. I felt like he was getting guys into place better, you know, recognizing, you know, when to check out of like this play and go into the other. But for me, like if you're comparing him to Matthew Stafford, I had to go and find this quote. Um, their coach, Mark Richt, at the time said that Stafford called out of about almost half of his plays. He was constantly communicating pre-snap, and when you compare those guys, it's really tough for me to get on board. So for me, I'm watching Levis. I see this big arm. I see this, you know, I see this ability, but I see a lot of game manager traits in terms of his throws and the fact he's a see it throw it passer in terms of, you know, throwing to guys, not throwing to where they're going to be at least consistently. That's where I think, depending on the games you watched, you know, you might have seen something different. Like I watched about 5 games, and the Ole Miss game to me is still the one that stands out the most because it's the biggest enigma out of all of them I've watched. He was consistently throwing it before guys broke, consistently throwing to windows in the middle of the field, and I was just like, where has this been in all of your games? You know, obviously I want to try and watch as much as I can on him to get an accurate picture. You know, I'm watching both 21 and 2022, and I'm honestly been more impressed with the stuff I've seen in 2022, and that's going with the, you know, the injury he was dealing with at the time, and the fact that Rich
The toe in
Scangronello
the
is,
shoulder, right?
yeah, the toe in the shoulder, and then the fact Rich Scangronello is
A mess.
not good,
Yeah.
not a very good schemer in terms of, you're going from Liam Cohen to dollar store Liam Cohen is how I describe that one. And you know, you talk about that. You mentioned it to me, and you said he plays like he has Jimmy Garoppolo tendencies almost, with just
Yeah.
a bigger arm, and I honestly agree with you on that because I'm watching this guy's footwork. I'm not. Jimmy can at least anticipate pretty well, but Levis is a guy who had to completely rebuild his mechanics from Penn State to going to Kentucky. When he threw at Penn State, he was a guy who struggled with his weight transfer. Ball would float a good bit, and he had to rebuild it. You know, he ended up like almost like shifting it more to like almost like a golfer's like stance in terms of getting that back hip through consistently. And you saw a lot more of a consistent velocity with him. I think he has a solid base from where he throws. I just think his accuracy stems from his hallway. He's not aiming in the right spot, and he's constantly looking at guys, not, you know, not aiming to where they're going to be. And I just wonder to myself, you're 24, you're going to be 24 years old as a rookie. How fixable is that? And is that worth, you know, wanting to go through the growing pains given the tendencies I've seen on film?
Billy, I'm gonna go to you. But the one thing I'll add is I have also seen the Stafford comparison. And the biggest reason the Stafford comparison bothers me is, yeah, we can get into some of it mentally. I didn't necessarily study Stafford when he was coming out of Georgia. I was 9 years old at the time. Now I've consumed a lot of draft information from the time, but I didn't really watch Stafford from that perspective.
Yeah.
So I'm not necessarily sure. But the one thing I know from Stafford's game, from what I've seen in the NFL compared to Levis, and this is the most concerning thing to me about Will Levis, is just the lack of athleticism inside the pocket. Stafford has got great quickness and great ability to move inside of the pocket and make people miss. Will Levis is actually a good athlete and a pretty good runner, but the pocket mobility, when we want to talk about like Josh Rosen, Dwayne Haskins, like being slow inside the pocket, that was concerning to me with Will Levis. His movement inside the pocket, inside just that space, not his movement as an athlete, just his
Yeah.
movement inside of the pocket. Jimmy Garoppolo is a comparison to me because he's slow footed. He's not necessarily a very light, agile player inside of there. Billy, what do you think of that? Am I going too far? And what do you think of Will Levis?
Yeah, so I go back to Ryan Tannehill. I think is how I would frame it, and I think the difference. Obviously, people are going to point out that Tannehill was, a wide receiver in college until he started playing quarterback. But at the same time, a lot of the issues with that Tannehill had, um, and it's you still see it today too. It's the pocket mobility aspect of his game. I think that with Levis, yeah, I don't see Matt Stafford at all. I mean, Stafford was, a consensus #1 overall pick, and he played with some, really talented players at Georgia too. But I think someone made this another comparison that really just sticks with me, and it's Jay Cutler, the Bears QB. But I think the difference with Levis is that his release is much more compact and twitchy. I think he doesn't throw doesn't have like a bad like a Blake Bortles style like release. Like it's very compact and he just throws it effortless in some senses. And so with him, like I mentioned it earlier, it's the intangible part and the fact that he battled through injuries. He played through a lot of um, other issues, like they had obviously Rich Scangarello was a problem for their offense, just not being able to design it effectively. But at the same time, they also replaced three guys on their offensive line. A lot of the skilled players they had, like Wandale Robinson, went to the NFL. Chris Rodriguez is a very talented running back, but if that's just the best skill player you have as a quarterback, it's not going to really help. Um, so there were certainly like mitigating factors that I can explain away to describe why he played poorly in 2022. But for me, like it's not necessarily the fact that he has the physical like traits. It's in 2021, I saw him, or even the past 2 years, like he played in an NFL offense and he knows the NFL footwork. And I think when he came out of high school in Connecticut, he was like probably a very raw quarterback. And the Penn State staff at the time, they tried to make him like a Taysom Hill type. And this is
Yes.
the beginning of like the Taysom renaissance, which was 2018. And he didn't want that. So, yeah, like people mention his age, and I think those are certainly valid points. But he also kind of got a little screwed over too with the COVID year, and he had to transfer, in
Right.
2021. Um, so there are certainly, again, people are probably thinking, "Why are you making so many excuses for the guy?" I'm not. I'm just trying to tell you, like, it's a very difficult evaluation. Like, if anyone
Context.
thinks
It matters.
exactly, if anyone thinks like they know that Will Levis is going to be a bust or is going to be a star, like they're probably wrong. Um, there's certainly a variance with him that needs to be kind of evaluated properly. But I do like him a little more, and I would argue like the medicals are probably something I'm much more concerned about than some of the issues that we talk about in a traditional quarterback sense.
Yeah. And I think both of you made some incredible points. To me, I think, Billy, that Jay Cutler comparison is phenomenal because I would say one of the traits that I guess we never really discuss when talking about quarterbacks is toughness. Jay
Yeah.
Cutler had toughness in spades. Will Levis is
Very
exceptionally
tough.
tough. And when you're talking about like who he is as a player to me, like yes, I know Nick will point to that Ole Miss game, which to me is an isolated example of a lot of anticipation from Will Levis on those throws. I do think
Of the
right
games I
now his
watched.
game as a processor is very much that if you put him in an offense like a Shanahan offense, he has the ability to execute obviously NFL level footwork and throw the ball to define spots in his first read without hesitation, on time and on rhythm. But then after that is where his game kind of breaks down, right? I talked about Jimmy Garoppolo. It is very Jimmy Garoppolo where it's very scattershot if he gets a late safety rotation. I did think the offense did him no favors, and that's where the Carson Wentz comparison comes in because he kind of compounds a bad play by making it worse, right? Protection gets screwed up and he has an erratic moment and turns the football over. He is a little bit turnover prone, I guess, if that's a thing. I guess I did think situationally a lot of his turnovers maybe could have been avoided, but it was also just a guy trying to make a play and trying to make a best of a pretty messy situation with receivers being in the same spot a lot, protection being busted a lot, like a
Oh my
lot.
gosh.
Like I'm
Yes.
not an expert on protection and what they're doing to set it up. I know the basic protections like jet protections, the basic protection slides. But gosh, like they would get 5-man pressures where there would be 2 guys completely unblocked and 3 guys blocking 1 guy and be like, what the hell is going on? And
Yeah.
people would be like, well, Will Levis doesn't feel pressure. I was like, well, no quarterback is thinking when you have 5 to block 5 that he's going to have to get rid of the ball in half a second. So I do think there is some nuance, like Billy suggested there with him. To me, what's concerning with him is the pocket mobility as an athlete. Like I think that that's such an important part of today's game. I think a lot of people equate it like quarterbacks need to have off schedule ability. They need to have whatever. Really, it's about being able to protect yourself. And the best way to do that is by being mobile in the pocket, right? Burrow is the class of the NFL at this. Brady was the class of the NFL of this for a long time, right? It's not necessarily how athletic you are, it's just how quick and agile you are in that space and how subtle your movements are. I don't think there's a lot of subtlety to Will Levis's game inside that 6x6 space that we call the pocket. And that's where I get a little bit concerned. Now, in terms of his projection, I still think despite all these negatives and all these comps, when you have a player with his size, his arm talent, and his toughness, I still think you take a chance there, even with all of these concerns. Like you bring up Jay Cutler. Jay Cutler was not the greatest quarterback. He did not have the greatest career, but I don't look at it as so binary as the set of traits he had meant that he was always going to have the career he had. And I think Levis, like Stroud, like Anthony Richardson, who we're going to talk about, like Bryce Young, is going to be a product of where he ends up. And I think if he ends up in the right place, and I think that right place would have to be a Shanahan style system where everything is very defined for him, where a lot of the processing is done for him, and you really highlight his best traits, which is his toughness and his arm. And I actually think a lot of the accuracy issues are tied into the fact that his process and where to go with the ball kind of becomes a mess when it's not completely defined and right there immediately. When it's there immediately on time and on schedule, he's actually an accurate thrower. I think sometimes the inaccuracy is part and parcel with him not exactly being sure of where he's throwing the ball. And therefore, that could lead to inconsistent placement. But when you throw all of that in, I still think that he's worthy of being taken with the top pick, because if you do put him in that style of system, and I mean, by all accounts, he seems to have like very, very good character. So if we want to pull in the Carson Wentz comp, like I think part of the Carson Wentz conversation has been the locker room stuff with him, and his inability to take coaching. It sounds like Will Levis isn't one of those guys. I don't really get into it because then it gets into too much of a hearsay. This guy said this guy said that, but it sounds like that's also a part of it. But I do think he's not necessary. I do think he's worthy of being taken, in the top 15, top 20, simply because there is a path for him to be an absolute star. It's just that path to me is a very, very specific growth pattern that needs to happen.
Yeah, you mentioned Carson Wentz. This is actually what's hard about the NFL process is sometimes even when teams have access to information. If you remember, Carson Wentz was considered that leader in North Dakota State.
character, right?
Yes, exactly.
You remember his preseason? He was studying tape during dinner with his girlfriend
Yes.
when they immediately traded Nick Foles, and they were like, "Oh my God, the Eagles hit a home run. What do you have, like a 40 on the Wonderlic?"
Yeah, it was something crazy like that, and it maybe it starts out that way, maybe it deteriorates over time. Who knows? Like that's the thing that's really tough about the NFL draft. You just don't know sometimes. Is for every Jalen Hurts, there's a Carson Wentz. We heard everything. Even knowing now what we know about Jalen Hurts, we knew he was that type of character.
Person, yeah.
Yes, he had those traits in terms of the intangibles that you would want to bet on. And I can get it with Will Levis. I definitely understand that aspect. But for me, the problem with the projection is I see more of, at least in terms of a likely outcome, the best outcome for me, I'm kind of like on the Ryan Tannehill spectrum, maybe late
Billy.
career Carson Palmer, like after Will Levis's second contract. I could see something like that, something similar. The problem for me is I just think Levis is not there at that stage of his development where maybe he might be more like a Daniel Jones or Jimmy Garoppolo early on. That's kind of where I'm at, and I can understand why people might disagree with that, and everyone's inclined to their processes and stuff like that, but I definitely I'm definitely not the. I definitely, as it stands right now, in terms of the film I've watched, I'm not in that top 10 spectrum with him right now. That's just my opinion.
Billy, let me send it over to you with this question and this thought for kind of a final conclusion on Will Levis. So we bring up Carson Wentz, right? I don't look at Carson Wentz's career. I think a lot of people are so result oriented with this process. Well, he stinks now, so that means he always stunk. Or he was a great player for his first 2 years with the Eagles, therefore he was going to always 100% be a great player, right? And I don't think it's necessarily like that. And I think his career is a perfect example of having to deal with some of the real things of life, having to deal with issues where your confidence comes and goes, and having to then deal with different things with circumstance that definitely affected how his career turned out. And if I look back at 2016 and the process that it takes to draft Carson Wentz second overall, now the intangible part, like Nick said, is the part that we just can never account for. But if you look at just the size and the translatable skills, I still think I would look at Carson Wentz and say, that's not a pick as a G. Like if I made that pick, I'm not necessarily slapping myself 10 years later if it didn't work out, or 2 years later if it didn't work out, because I think the process was there. And so that's how I feel about Wentz. Tell me if you agree with that. Tell me if you think that's a completely ridiculous take. And that's part of why I'm a little bit more okay, I guess, with taking Levis high, perhaps compared to Nick.
Yeah, but I think the thing with Wentz is that he went to a uh, blue blood FCS program in North Dakota State. I mean, they are like the Alabama of um, FCS football. Like they are expected to win the national championship every year, and so for me, with respect to Levis, it's like he did face adversity. I mean, he was recruited to Penn State, a
Right.
Big Ten school, and he figured that he can't make it there, and he has to transfer. Now, obviously, there are reasons why they felt he wasn't a good enough passer because they were using him as a Taysom Hill type, and so I just think those type of adverse situations really helps build character. Again, we can't really judge it on the outside, so we can only just go off of what we read and from others. And so for me, like I just think with Levis, it's um, like teammates obviously like the guy, and being in this modern day NIL college football, it's not a situation where you're going to have the same teammates year after year. He's going to have new teammates come in, transfers, freshmen. And so I just think like read a lot of positive reviews about the guy's just his overall toughness and his character. And I certainly think that I was lower on Wentz as a prospect. I think there was just a lot of Blake Bortles to his game, and that's where I don't really agree with the comparisons, is because Wentz had that long throwing motion
Right. The
that he
elbow.
Yeah,
exactly,
yeah.
and
Very
I don't see
unnatural.
that with um, with Levis. I don't see that at all. I think it's like I said, it's much more efficient and it's quick. So yeah, I mean, I also think maybe Wentz was a little better, like as within the pocket too. So I don't
Yeah,
want to say like,
I think the big comparison, right, with Levis and Wentz is simply just the erraticness that comes with pressure, right? It's with
yeah,
pressure, you don't really know the ball can be thrown up for grabs whenever and wherever. And yeah, it's also fumbles can happen. It's yeah.
yeah, he certainly has a very um, erratic style, as you say. I don't want to take anything away from that type of uh, those type of issues because they're real, and he has to explain why certain interceptions happen, why certain sacks happened. It's very easy for us on the outside to say he has terrible feel inside the pocket, but if an offensive tackle like just completely misses, um, his assignment and there's a free rusher, then yeah, it's tough. Um, so yeah, what I want to kind of get just my final takeaway on Will Levis is like I understand the issues that people always cite. Initially I was kind of on board with yeah, the groupthink of let's trash the guy, he stinks, he's never going to be good. But as I started to read more and more about what he went through injuries, turnover personnel wise, turnover with his coaching staff, and again, the injuries and just everything that occurred, I became a little more sympathetic to his cause. And so,
Cause, huh?
yeah, I mean, I don't, I mean, it was I mean, Kentucky had a very like decent year. I mean, they're pretty much like a 6 to 8 win team each season now, but um, I don't necessarily think that he did anything either to elevate the situation. He did his best, but I mean, and that's the question. It's like, are the injuries going to become, a regular thing? Like he's certainly, like I said, you guys have said it too. He's built really well, but if you're suffering injuries, then is that going to be something that should be monitored in the future?
Yeah, 100%. And before we go to good old Anthony Richardson, one last point that what you just said reminded me with Will Levis. And I texted Nick about this very early in the draft process, or early in the process for me of watching these quarterbacks. Is it was nice to actually see one of these guys go through consistent adversity. In
Yes.
the last few years of watching quarterbacks for me, whether it's Mac Jones, Justin Fields, Trevor Lawrence, any of these guys, Zach Wilson, Trey Lance, it's clean pockets, open receivers, and a lot of aesthetically great throws. But like Billy said, a lot of questions of what is actually possible of happening in an NFL game. And it's become so much where these quarterbacks are in these big programs and these great offenses with great receivers, great protection, that and so much of being a great quarterback is really how do you handle adversity? How do you handle pressure when protection busts, and how do you handle when you have to, when you don't have receivers that are necessarily getting open and you have to make a lot of big boy throws into tight windows and throw these receivers open. And a lot of times with these quarterbacks, as talented as they are, it really is projection. We don't really know how they can handle chaos. We don't know how they can handle it. The nice thing about Levis is it took me back to watching the quarterbacks that used to come out, because they used to all play in these kind of middle of the road programs within their conferences, and you would have to see them go through that. We got to
Yes.
see Levis actually have to go through getting hit, sometimes a lot, sometimes too much, having to go through receivers running into each other and having to play the next play after that, having to go through, I mean, protection bust. After they had a protection bust just about every drive. Like, it was so bad with them and protection. And so having to go through all of that, like Billy said, I think it's very, very cool because there seems to be a positive response from him character wise that can be taken away from that. But let's go to, perhaps, is he the most polarizing player in the draft? I mean, I don't know if anybody's stock has increased in the last 2 weeks or so. There's been a lot of people jumping on this hype train. Like I said earlier, the same 8 plays I've seen posted by 35 different accounts on Twitter of pocket movement, phenomenal throw, pocket movement, phenomenal throw. Oh, if he could do this, he's going to be a superstar quarterback. I absolutely agree with that statement. But at the Mick Narton, we're coming to you for something a little more nuanced than just those 8 plays that are on Twitter. What do you think of Anthony Richardson, and how do you kind of project your outlook for him coming into the 2023 draft?
So the funny thing about groupthink is when you're ahead of the curve, and when people were ready to give up on Anthony Richardson, I was noting his pocket, like his ability to just navigate within the pocket in terms of game against LSU, game against Kentucky. Kentucky game is not good on paper if you look at the box score, but you see a lot of the traits that stand out. And I think that's one of the things that's so interesting about Anthony Richardson. People are going to, people, obviously the group think is really strong between the Levises and the Anthony Richardsons. I think it's important everyone sticks to their own evaluation and their process of what they value versus what others value. And for me, with the thing with Anthony Richardson, he has the ability to throw from he throws with better anticipation than I expect a 21-year-old to be able to do. And I think the fact this was his first full year starting in the offense was so encouraging in terms of just being able to, you know, throw guys open with anticipation. I thought that was a huge step. I thought he was really under like this is something that this is a top tier trait that I look for in quarterbacks, and this was a big thing with Mahomes. Do you have your body, is your head and your body like aligned to where you're throwing consistently? Or are you like trying to get that defender out of the picture and then throw him and then kind of like maybe square your shoulders or whip your arm angle like the other way? And I see Richardson do that, and those are the types of plays that get me super excited about a guy like that. And you talk about the pocket movement, and I like guys who keep their not only their eyes up but also have the contact balance to be able to shake guys off, but also being able to make guys miss in condensed spaces. Like he's not making movements, like he knows how to manipulate guys, and that's a big thing with me. And it's one of the biggest differences between him and like Justin Fields, because while Fields was super accurate, Richardson, he has issues with his base. Like sometimes it gets really narrow, sometimes it gets really wide. He heel clicks a lot, and he can get very toesy at times. Like there's a lot, there's things to fix underneath the hood with that regard. But you see the ability to throw from those awkward platforms, not necessarily moving, because I do think he's a little bit overrated when he's on the move. I think when he's off, like he's throwing from an awkward platform though, standing within the pocket, that's a top tier like trait to have. You don't need
It's
the perfect platform to be able to make that type of throw. And I think that's the thing that's really appealing about Anthony Richardson to me, because I value the nuance of what he shows, and obviously the running ability special.
yeah,
Just he has legitimate 4.4 speed. Like I think I've seen like Dante Culpepper comparisons, which is I think
ludicrous.
that's absolutely insane, because one, I think Culpepper wasn't as fluid, but also Culpepper was a way more accurate player at the time, just based off everything I've read on him. And thing about Richardson, the ability within the pocket, people compare him to Josh Allen in that regard. I think Allen, thing with me is he was great on the move. He made a lot of big time throws. Thing I noticed with Richardson, the way he makes those plays within the pocket and the way he can like manipulate with his eyes, it's not to this extent, because I was high on this guy. I see a lot more Lamar Jackson than I do Josh Allen with Anthony Richardson. And I'm not sure if people have that, takeaway, but that's kind of how I felt watching him, because the things I valued about Lamar from a mental perspective, they kind of jump out with me with Anthony Richardson. Granted, I think his mechanical issues are different. Lamar mainly threw from a narrow base, so that's why he wasn't very accurate outside the numbers, and he threw within the hashes more than he threw outside, at least with success. And Richardson is way better outside thrower in terms of throwing the deep ball. And I think that's one of the interesting debates between him and Levis. They're both really good deep ball passers, but I think I value the nuance and the age difference a little bit more, to the point where I feel there's more upside to be tapped, versus I think Levis could be a good player. I just don't know if he could be special. And even if Richardson busts, I want to go on the type of player that could be special, and I see special traits, and that's why I feel a little strong about Richardson.
Billy, what do you think of Anthony Richardson? Nick said a lot there, a lot of good there, a lot of bad. I do think Nick was complimenting him a little bit on the off schedule stuff. Sometimes I think it's kind of an Aaron Rodgers situation where he creates situations where his feet aren't exactly in the right place when they don't necessarily need to be. Like he doesn't need to throw off schedule, but he's throwing not off schedule, off platform, but he is throwing off platform. So I do think there is a little bit of that self-inflicted access, but obviously I'm gonna share my thoughts in a little bit. We got to go to you first, Billy. What do
Yeah,
you think of Anthony Richardson?
yeah, I think he did have a touchdown throw against South Carolina where he did a no look pass. Um, so yeah, for me with him, I mean, the physical traits are just out of this world. And when you talk about physical traits, you talk about obviously the arm strength, you talk about the um, high-end athlete that he is. I mean, he's built like Cam Newton, Josh Allen. So those are just when I talk about the upside, that's what I'm talking about. Now, as a passer, it's again, it's much more erratic than Levis, in my opinion, especially on a consistent basis. Uh, And for a guy that is as mobile as he is, he, I personally, like outside of that 2 point conversion against Utah, I didn't see him make enough plays outside the pocket and second reaction, like the type of throws that we saw Mahomes make at Texas Tech, where he's just like rolling out of the pocket and chucking it like
Yeah.
40, 50 yards. I don't even know if I remember him attempting many. So, and that's, I'm not suggesting that's a prerequisite at all. I think that I would much rather him um, operate within the pocket. And so you can totally see him trying to do the right thing, like in the pocket with his movement and just the way he's able to feel pressure. It's just, he's just inaccurate. And certainly, like the plays that stand out to me, where he's able to just navigate in the pocket very well, step up, you know, clean pocket, all that, everything just works for him, and he's able to just unleash like a deep ball down the field. Like it looks good, and there are several examples of him like throwing with defenders hitting him at the last second too, and there are examples of him throwing with touch and layers to different areas of the field. Um, it's not consistent. None of this is consistent. There's just examples of it. I mean, it doesn't. It's not consistent at all, and that's the biggest issue with him. It's how do you um, get this giant ball of clay or whatever it is? You have all of the ingredients that you need to be potential a potential Josh Allen type. It's just molding him into that, and again with Josh Allen and the Cam Newton comparisons, I mean, you have to understand like those guys also elevated programs to reach really high levels. Like Wyoming, it's a decent program now. It always has been, but um, Josh Allen was like the face of
Right.
Wyoming football, and Cam Newton took Auburn to led them to a
He took one
national
of the
Cam
championship.
Newton
he
is an
took one of the
under
crap he took one of the crappiest rosters we've ever seen win a national championship
Cam
and won a
Newton is the
national
most
championship.
Yeah,
underrated prospect. Like he's so disrespected in terms of guys that just get comped to him.
Not
And
just prospect. I feel like quarterback in
no,
general. Like
yeah,
yeah,
people just like think that the people had this assumption that throughout Cam Newton's career he was who he ended up being at the end in New England a little bit, though I thought he actually played pretty well the second half of the year in New England. And then what he was when he came back with Carolina. And I feel like they've just set in that that's who Cam Newton was. Like they think that he's just this like big, inaccurate passer who could run. But we're talking about a guy who scored 35 touchdowns his rookie year in the NFL.
yeah. And
Special player.
so for sure, and I just think like Todd McShay kind of raved about it as well. Like the guy's very intelligent. He has very good character. Um, Other people on ESPN have said it. Matt Miller said it today. Laura Rutledge, who covers the SEC on Saturday, said it. But one thing that McShay kind of mentioned is that does Richardson have that alpha dog personality like a Cam Newton or Josh Allen when
Mm-hmm.
maybe you just need to kind of will your team to victory in those situations. And I mean, those are certainly valid points, but let's be honest, that Florida team this year didn't really have much talent. I know they have a couple offensive line prospects who should, get drafted, and but his skill talent wasn't good at all. I mean, Pearsall was a decent wide receiver, but he's returning, so yeah, he's a fascinating evaluation fish. But for me, like it's really tough to pass on that type of athlete. And like I just hate the Malik Willis comparisons. Like Richardson is
they
much
suck.
Yeah, it's
bigger.
BS.
He played in the SEC. Like let's just stop that.
he can
Yeah.
actually see in the middle of the field. Like,
Right.
Yeah.
To me, he's in terms of physical gifts since Allen, when you put it all together, maybe Lawrence, he's probably the
I mean,
most
Jordan Love had some physical gifts too, and I think people have made that comparison a little bit.
right, but the speed, the Jordan Love couldn't run like this. This is a guy who
No, he
scored in
couldn't.
what, an 80-yard touchdown versus LSU. He can really run. To me, the thing we were talking about earlier about quarterbacks with certain physical traits that immediately get equated to having off schedule and off structure ability. This is a prime example of certain traits being that he's not very good out of structure. He's not very good passing, outside of the pocket. He's actually a lot better inside of the pocket throwing the football to me
and it's
than he
funny
is. Yeah.
because
That
if you
was
hear
what
them,
Cam Newton wasn't that guy either. His out of structure was mainly him running. He wasn't the guy
Right.
who scrambled and chucked it downfield.
and
Go
that's
ahead,
funny
Nick.
about the narrative, because if you go to the media narrative, it's, oh, this guy can make so many off script plays, but he's not as sound in the pocket. But if you turn on his film for like one game, you could see that's the complete opposite.
Right.
And
Right.
that's where I just kind of see like more of the Lamar stuff than the Josh Allen. Now, not a 1-to-1 comparison. Obviously, Lamar was way more complete coming out. Want to stress that ahead of time.
Yeah.
And one thing with Lamar too is that his first year starting 2015, he was a complete mess.
Yes.
Right.
But
Right.
in 2016, that's the year he won the Heisman. He just completely um, reshaped himself. Or was it? Yeah, 2016 he won the Heisman. In 2017, was his final year. And in 2016, you remember that game in Clemson where him and Deshaun Watson
Right.
went back battled. And so that's just the thing. And why I really wish that Richardson went back to school for another year. And I don't know what's happening at Florida. They're losing coaches left and right.
Right.
But if he just went back to school for another year and went through like another year of development, I think that would have been good. And I think I also have to mention like he was, Dan Mullen his final year didn't do the best job of using him. He started Emory Jones over him. He barely used Damian Pierce, so he certainly
Right.
is culpable for
Yeah.
the lack of development in this situation. But yeah, I just think like the biggest thing with Richardson is just he needs to play to get acclimated to an NFL team.
Yeah. And to me, he's very, very polarizing. I hate the Josh Allen comparison. Big, fast does not mean Josh Allen. First of all, Josh Allen, Cam Newton, when we're talking about those two quarterbacks, their size is an anomaly in NFL history. Like, if we're talking about the biggest quarterbacks we've ever seen, those two guys are oftentimes the biggest dudes on the football field, and their size is a very, very imposing part of their game. And Richardson's a big dude, but he's not that big. Where his size, I mean, I remember Allen in Wyoming, one of the most interesting experiences I've ever had watching a player, because he had no clue how to play within structure. Their protection was crappy. The receivers sucked, and every play was just him running outside of the pocket. And it was
Yes.
either the greatest throw you've ever seen or the worst throw you've ever seen. Nothing in between. That was just every play of his college career. And he learned how to play within structure, and bang, his game evolved. To me, Richardson's comp, and it's not a stylistic comp, it's just in terms of kind of my process with where I am in the draft, is Trey Lance from 2 years ago, in the sense that there are subtleties to his game that you find to be very refined for a guy that has the experience that he has. But the inconsistencies throwing the ball, especially short intermediate, the lack of, I would say, complexity and advancement and refinement in terms of how he throws the ball. It's the antithesis of Stroud to me, right? Stroud has like 35-year-old veteran maturity and sense of he knows what pace to put on the ball. He knows how much touch to put on it. He just has an innate feel for how to make every single throw the most catchable throw for his receiver. Richardson, it's a little bit Billy mentioned, there are examples of him layering the ball. There's examples of him throwing with touch, but there's also examples of him not doing that. And when the sample size is so low, as it was with Trey Lance, it's hard to put stock in which one of the two. Now, I think they're stylistically different, but I do think the constant between them is the fact that they're these uber physical prospects with subtle senses of refinement, right? With Trey Lance, it was subtle moments of processing that you felt like, oh, that's not what 287 throws should get you at. And in some ways, Richardson, it's the pocket movement, the feel, the innate like
It's
balance and
similar.
ability to manipulate the pocket. It's as good as anybody in the draft, not named Bryce Young. It's something I hated about Levis's game. Richardson's the opposite. But at the same time, I don't know if I look at the sample size. To me, it's scary. I know how talented the player is, but the fact that I don't have any confidence in any part of his game just because I don't feel like I have enough of a sample to completely take it to the bank. That's where I completely agree with Billy. I feel like one more year of watching him play would have done. Maybe it doesn't do him any good because maybe he's already a superstar and that very well could be the case. But for me, as somebody who's watching him, it would make me a lot more comfortable with his game because I would have a great sample of, hey, this is what he does, this is who he is, rather than, holy cow, he's one of the most physically gifted prospects I've ever seen. And then he just had 3 plays where I looked at it and his pocket management, his manipulation, his sense of timing, and then how he threw it, with people around him was like, oh, this is a top, future top 5 quarterback in the NFL. And then 3 plays later, it's where are you throwing it to? What are you throwing it to? How did you miss it that bad? And that's where he's a very much of an enigma to me. And just like I said with Trey Lance, to me, if there's enough of uncertainty there, when you're talking about, again, a top 5, top 10 pick at quarterback, now he's going to go in that range, but that's scary to me to touch a player like that. And again, just like Trey Lance, because remember, the other thing with Trey Lance was intangibly and all of that, he ended up boosting himself up the draft process. It sounds like Richardson brings the same high intelligence, great work ethic, great intangibles, and all of that as well. And again, that's the part that we can't measure. And that's the part that, guys like Jalen Hurts who have truly improved. That's what Dak Prescott, these guys, they've had like just special character, charisma, and ability to carry themselves amongst their teammates. And maybe Richardson has that in spades too, and that'll ultimately boost him over the top. But when the sample size is this small and there's the concerns I have about just his accuracy and consistency throwing the ball exists this much to this point, I don't know if I would trust taking that sort of a player that high in the draft.
I think you bring up a good point about Trey Lance and the sample size and like the similarities there. And, part of me is knowing my biases and what I look for in quarterback evaluation. And a lot of the same things you mentioned about Lance and Richardson, they very much align. And we've seen with Lance, he's been very unlucky with injuries and stuff like that. And that's held back his development. We don't know what he is going into year three. And that's a really big concern because he's only had 1 year of college and like
600 throws since his freshman year of high school.
Yeah,
Bryce Young's got 900 in college.
That's insane to think about, honestly. Just absolutely ridiculous. But yeah, you play that risk, especially with Richardson, who does like to run, and he could get himself hurt. He could put himself behind potentially. Not saying it would be a 1-to-1, obviously. It's just important to keep in track, all the scenarios when you draft a quarterback like that with the amount of starts they've had.
I agree. Guys, this has been awesome. We've gone here for 1 hour and 43 minutes. I don't know how time is working for you guys. I know we did want to touch on a few more guys that are later in the draft. Like I said, there's a very deep quarterback class. Perhaps we might have to do another stream where we talk about the Jake Hainers, the Houston quarterback, Clayton Tune. There it is. Jaron Hall, who Nick put me on, who I'm intrigued by.
Your guy DTR, man.
Hey, if we're talking 6th, 7th round pick, my guy DTR. If we're talking anywhere before that, not my guy DTR. But yeah, there's a few more guys. I would say that perhaps we should do another stream and talk about that. I do want to leave it with this kind of, and I'm going to put both of you on the spot. Give me your ranking 1 through 4. I kind of have a ranking in mind, but it's kind of fluid because I do think there's a clear 2 tiers clear 3 tiers, I actually think, between the players in terms of who they are now. But then I think the projection of who they will be in the future makes the tiers a little more muddy, that I kind of separated into 2. Billy, I'm going to put you on the spot first because you seem to be a little too lax and a little less under. Nick seems to be feeling the pressure of erratically scrambling and picking in his mind on how he's going to rank these guys. But you look way
Stetson
too
Bennett,
cool for school over
QB1.
there. Okay, now we understand why you're so cool for school. I mean, you went the quarterback wins route.
No. In all seriousness, Bryce Young is like in a tier of his own to me. I think that the next three guys, you can separate them however you'd like. And let me just be clear, I'm fine taking all of these guys in the top 10, but if I had the number one overall pick, or if I had to pick the first quarterback without question, it's Bryce Young. But I would feel comfortable taking the other three in the top 10 as well. And then number two would be CJ Stroud. Three, I don't, I can't really separate Levis and Richardson. I would have 3A, 3B. They're both they're enigmas, I guess, in a sense. So, yeah, like someone just said, I mean, it's Bryce Young and the rest, but at the same time, I would still take the other three in the top 10. Just my own opinion.
Nick.
So I'm actually a little different. I actually have Stroud and Young a little closer in terms of just how I feel. In terms of how I'd rank them, I'd put them like 1A and 1B right now. I'm going through, I've gone through most of Stroud's film because I've gone through his 21 and a good amount of his 22.
Right.
Young, I've gone through his most important games, like the SEC championship game against Georgia, which is just absolutely ludicrous film, absolutely like some of the best film you'll ever watch, and that's tough, to rank them between, because I do think Young has some things that he has to address outside of the film that might be a little tougher, while Stroud has some things on the film but is scattershot in terms of the consistency of what comes to, like, can he make the pocket presence and like the anticipation, which I think is more consistent than the pocket presence and the movement. After that, I think it's Anthony Richardson. I've put Anthony Richardson actually in a tier by himself. I think he's a boom bust type of tier. And I think the boom for me is so much so that I would want to bet on a guy like that, knowing the things I look for in quarterbacks and the process of what I personally want in a quarterback. And then I have Levis in a tier below that because I think I see him being a starting quarterback. I want to get this out of the way. I see a starting quarterback with him. I see a guy who can stick around the league, maybe have some really good years towards the latter part of his career, like a Carson Palmer. I don't feel comfortable with him on that first contract right now to the point I'd want to bet on him. So that's why I'm kind of have him a little lower overall.
Yeah, and those are, I think, two very fair ways to look at it. I think this quarterback class can be ranked. It's really the cool thing about this class is, to me, there's no Joe Burrow that's so outstanding that at the top it's him. I feel like you can make an argument on different reasons for why you prefer one prospect over another. My ranking is go ahead.
It's similar to the 2020 group outside of Joe Burrow.
Right.
It's like it's got a lot of like, oh, these consistent plays, and then like you have the inconsistencies and some of the questions with size. Those are the things you have to kind of like figure out like outside. And I think that's what's really cool about this class, because having everything cut and dry is not so fun. I don't really like that. I like trying to figure out who I personally prefer, and whether or not, I don't really care if it lines up with what people say or what they don't, but it's always fun to, go against the grain every now and then.
No, you're 100% right there, Nick. And I think this class has been really fun, and I can't wait because there's a few more guys that I want to watch a little bit more. And then there's a lot more I want to still watch with these guys. And there's a lot of people who I really respect who I'm waiting to hear their more in-depth thoughts on the quarterback position, and then seeing how that changes my outlook on these guys. But my ranking is actually a lot more similar to Billy. I do think it's Bryce a tier by himself. Like I said, I think, look, the size is an issue. And like Nick said, those are questions that he can't necessarily answer to us with his play. Those are questions he's going to have to answer in his conversation in terms of how much you feel like he processes the game and he's able to play fast enough where, the game looks so slow for him now. Will it be that way in the NFL? We will see. But I also do think there's specific outliers. And we go back to the Parcells one, and Sean Payton used the outlier that Parcells drafted in that Hurd interview with Colin Cowherd when he talked about, the current Lions defensive coordinator, Aaron Glenn, 5'9" cornerback, right? Not prototype size, but they said the movement was special enough where you take him in the top 10. To me, there was an Alabama player that came out a couple years ago that was very similar. Devonta Smith had unprecedented size, but everything else about his game was so top notch that to me, he was still a top 15 pick in the draft. It didn't matter with the size. And Bryce Young, again, he is an outlier to me. Every part of his game is so phenomenal that I'm able to overlook the size. And I've told both of you, I'm horny for size when it comes to quarterbacks. I think it matters. Like Chris Sims always says
I agree.
Size is a skill. And to me, it very much is. Like, I prefer big people in a sport where big people kill big people. That's just the way I see it. The other three, I really think you can have it however you want it. I do think they're in the same tier. I think their path to success is all very, very much different. I think I would actually put Anthony Richards. No, I can't do that. I'd probably put Stroud second, play it safe, Levis third, Richards 3A, 3B, just do the same cop-out Billy did. It's just so hard. It's
there you
because,
go, Vish.
I mean, it's so hard for me to rank the three of those guys because I think all three of them are so reliant on where they end up for me on how they become successful. With Stroud, to me, he has to go to a place that sufficiently can surround him, whether it's give him some protection and give him people to throw to. I don't know if he's necessarily going to be overcoming bad protection and a lack of weapons, perhaps the way I think Young can, and the way Young showed glimpses of being able to do with Alabama, right? Even with Alabama's talent, their talent didn't feel like it was Tua throwing to Jerry Jeudy, Henry Ruggs, Waddle, and Devonta Smith with 3 or 4 first rounders protecting him and 2 first round backs in Jacobs and Najee. It didn't feel that way to me. And so, I would say with Stroud, it's that. With Levis, like you said, Nick, I think that for Levis to be a player tomorrow that starts, it's very system specific. He has to go to a place where everything is very defined in terms of where he's going with the ball when he catches it. He needs to have a very clear structure on what he's looking at. And to me, that's a Shanahan-McVay offense. Now, there's about 15 different teams running it in the NFL, so that's what helps him out. But to me, he has to be in that style system for us to see the best of him. In fact, I got another comp for you. He actually reminds me a little bit of Matt Schaub.
Ooh, I like that. I think he's got a little bit better of an arm, but I can.
I would say his arm's a little better.
He's got a better arm, and he's also a better athlete. He's just a better runner. But in terms of his actual movement inside of the pocket when he's throwing,
I could see it.
It's close to Schaub in some ways. Yeah. I don't know if he processes as well as Matt Schaub. We're going quite far back, but definitely Matt Schaub's post-snap process was pretty solid. Will Levis's post-snap process is questionable.
Well, and that's the thing too. Like, if you take a look at the other 3 teams that are potentially rumored to move up, Indianapolis. Well, take Houston out. Indianapolis, Atlanta was rumored today, and Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think those are situations that would suit any of the 3, but particularly Levis and Richardson, because we'll see how Indianapolis does with their new head coach. But I mean, he clearly came from a background of developing young, raw quarterbacks in Los Angeles and Philadelphia. And I think Arthur Smith is one of the most underrated play callers in the entire NFL. And if he actually had like competent quarterback play, I think they would have been a much better team last year.
All right, Billy, you just got my wheels turning. All right. We're going to end the show a little bit hot because I actually completely agree with you. I think when we go that route, forget the rankings. I made you guys rank them, and then I didn't even fully rank them. I bailed myself out. But, hey, it's my show. I get to do that. So
yeah, please
screw the haters. Man. Screw the haters. But what I was going to say was I think Indianapolis would be an ideal fit for Anthony Richardson. I think Steichen can embrace that sort of development plan that might be required with Anthony Richardson. I think Atlanta and Will Levis is an awesome fit. But if Atlanta can get anybody, Lamar would be with Atlanta, with Arthur Smith. And then I actually have a very interesting spot for CJ Stroud because obviously all four of these guys are probably going to be top 15 picks. And if you want me to tell you a spot where I think CJ Stroud can succeed day one, if I'm the Seattle Seahawks, they won't do this, but I'd let Geno Smith go sign for a lot of money somewhere. And I think CJ Stroud would kind of fit exactly what they're looking for in a quarterback. Pretty like right in the glove. Now they can't do it because Geno played way too well for you to ever let a quarterback that plays that well walk away. But if you're talking about being cost effective at the quarterback position and making a risky Moneyball-esque move, like to me, that's a place where you can, when you've got those two young tackles and an ascending offensive line with two of, I would say, a top 5 receiver duo in the sport of football, an excellent run game, especially with, I would say, a top 5 running back in the sport in Kenneth Walker. That might be a little controversial, but I think he's that spectacular and special. And so when you throw all that in, I would say, like, when I tell you I have concerns, if you tell me Levis is in Atlanta with that Arthur Smith style offense where he's used kind of in a Tannehill way, you tell me Richardson is in Indianapolis and Stroud is in Seattle, I am high on all 3 of them.
So one last thing I want to add, you're talking about like the best fit for Stroud. This team will not do this because they've got
like
their
Vegas?
eyes. No, they got no, not them. They
Okay.
got this team's got their eyes set in free agency. If the Jets moved up for CJ Stroud, that would be an incredible fit for them.
Vish
Right.
loves it.
It's in my opinion, that's the type of situation that would just be ideal. You got reuniting with one of your best receivers in college. They have familiarity. It's huge in that regard. The offensive line is functional when it's healthy. Elijah Tucker would make a lot of sense.
Right.
I don't know. The Raiders is possible, but overall the Jets feel like to me like one of the best fits, but they're not going to do that. They got their eyes set on Carr and Rodgers right now.
Right. I've never seen anybody talk about Carr the way Robert Saleh talked about Carr.
Yeah, that was crazy.
Yeah.
I did see a report that the Raiders actually had Anthony Richardson very high on their list. I wouldn't be surprised if they took him. I listened to Mike Lombardi's podcast, and both of his sons work for the Raiders, and he was raving about Richardson. So that kind of just provided some subtle clues about maybe them potentially being interested in him.
And there have been clues about McDaniels trying to embrace a dual threat style quarterback for a while now, right? Like they were flirting with the Lamars and all of them at the end of their tenure in New England. And then he brought in Cam, and they said that McDaniels had been trying to do this for so long, and they really like Cam. So you're absolutely right there, Billy.
But back to your Seattle point, I tweeted this, and my friend that I'm sure some people follow, Carter Donick, who's a Seahawks fan, also agreed with me, is that I tweeted this back in January. It's I think that if Levis or Richardson ended up in Seattle, I think that they would succeed. I'm not saying that I tweeted that they're bust proof, but obviously everyone has, no one's going to be guaranteed to be good. But I just think that infrastructure of an organization that's had their head coach for over a decade now. They have an offensive system that's very well defined that suits both players. You don't have to rush either of them to play immediately. I just feel like that would be the ideal spot for one of those quarterbacks. And let's be honest, Geno's 32 years old. It's not like he's still 20 in his 20s. So I think Pete Carroll mentioned it at his presser, is that they're going to be interviewing all of these quarterbacks, and I wouldn't be surprised if they took one of them. And I think that either Levis or Richardson or even Stroud, as you say, they'd all be really good fits in Seattle. Just again, it's that McVay offense, and they have the skill talent, and they have a very young ascending offensive line on top of that.
Nick, what do you think of that?
I completely agree with a situation like that. I have my opinions on Levis and versus Richardson, but I do think Levis in that type of infrastructure, especially with those weapons, that growing offensive line, Abraham Lucas, Charles Cross, were very good as they showed very good promise as rookies, and that type of situation is so ideal for a young quarterback that they'd be stupid not to look at a quarterback in this year's draft. And Pete Carroll, they know this. Geno Smith is 32 years. He's in his 30s, and it's not necessarily something you ideally want. He played very well down the stretch, and
Right.
he was exceptional at times, especially in a game like the Saints game. But you go with the types of plays that Geno could make and types of plays Stroud could make. That one to me is the most obvious one. Like, if you want something more similar to Geno with some off script ability, but
a little less power in his arm.
Yes, agree. Yeah, agree. Like, you would get a lot of the same things that you get from Geno that you do in Stroud, and I think that would be a really solid fit. And if they want to go the dual threat, one, the Levis and the Richardson one would make a lot of sense as well.
Yeah, and I do think Billy's underlying point there, he did kind of give Richardson and Levis some flowers. I think the underlying point is that Seattle is kind of the dream landing spot for any young quarterback if they do decide
Detroit
to go
too.
that direction, right? Especially because I think the one thing I would put them over Detroit is I like Detroit's offensive talent maybe a hair better because their offensive line is a hair better, or it's not a hair better, it's just better. But the one thing Pete Carroll has shown is that he knows how to play to his quarterback strength, right? He did it for Russell Wilson. He did it for Geno Smith. And so you would imagine that whichever quarterback ends up there, the Seahawks are not going to blow up the plan for that quarterback by making him do stuff that he's not comfortable doing or uncharacteristic for him. They're going to try and play to whatever strengths that quarterback has. And therefore, you would think if there's any chance for that guy to succeed, it's on that team. But guys, this was awesome. We went on for 2 hours. The conversation was so natural. Both of you did an awesome job. It was awesome having you both. It looks like we're going to have to do it again. You guys don't have a choice in the matter. It's we went for 2 hours.
To you,
we
Vish,
talked
man.
about a few different quarterbacks, so it sounds like you guys are going to have to come back for a part 2. But I really appreciate you guys taking the time. This was awesome. I appreciate your insight, the level of research, the level of detail that you put into this. This was awesome. Everybody, please like, subscribe, share. Make sure you're following at the Mick Narton and make sure you're reading his work on the Steelers Nation. He is a Steelers fan. I don't have any positive or negative opinions on Steelers fans, so I guess Nick escapes there. But he is he is a lot more informed than on just the Steelers. He's the guy who spotted Mahomes before Mahomes, just saying. And then below me, of course, I think most Niners fans know him. I feel like Billy's like an honorary Niners content
Twitter
creator, despite being a podcast host for The Roar. And being, are you a Panthers fan, Billy?
We have a complicated relationship.
Okay, I'll leave it at that. But make sure you're following him too at BillyM_91. He's the animated guy who somehow is able to clip everything and anything and have it on Twitter ready to go for you before you even watched it on TV. So I think more people should be following him. I'd imagine a lot of people already are following him, but if you aren't, follow him. And then, of course, please like, subscribe, share, comment down below what you think is the ranking of these quarterbacks. And then comment down below sleeper quarterbacks that you want us to talk about when we reconvene and do this again. I'm sure there will be some Jake Haener conversation, Clayton Tune, Jaron Hall, throw in anybody else. Billy will love to talk about good old DTR. So please do that. It really does help the algorithm. But everybody, I'll catch you next time. Thank you.